That's okay. Thank you. Thank you for understanding, and please make my apologies to everybody.
Okay. We have a quorum, so we'll go ahead and open. We're not going to do minutes or anything like that. Really just want to spend the next hour sharpening focus on what what we'll go into the budget work session next Tuesday. To catch everyone up, yesterday we had a meeting amongst the advisory board chairs and Dr. Cannon. So give me a few minutes. I'll kind of share some of the discussion we had in that, and then I'll talk about the work session and how it's going to play out based on my conversation with Dr. Cannon, and then we'll go into the draft presentation I sent out and make sure that first draft. So definitely want your input and ideas on sharpening it, and then we'll go for version 2, and then my goal is Saturday to send it out to the school board, however they post it, in the agenda, things of that nature, but to allow enough time for folks to absorb the input that we've given. So we met yesterday with Dr. Cannon. We usually do these about every 6 weeks or so. So a few things that came up that I think are worthy of discussion here, and just being aware of kind of where different folks are in their view of the budget. So we had a pretty good discussion about the level of investment involved with this budget, and the use of reserves and the sizable closeout to make some of the larger investments that we've seen in the Arlington school budget in some time, but also obviously noting, opportunity to note our concerns that, how, given the volume of what we did this year in the budget, how sustainable is it? And, so part of the view was, with the sizable reserves and closeout that we had, there was a degree of comfort in the risk that was being taken, understanding that, certainly going forward, there's got to be revenue to match what we're signing up for in terms of recurring expenses. But it was an opportunity that was seen to make investments that we just in the past few years have not been able to make, whether it's in compensation, special education, and other areas of the budget. That was the view of some in the room. And I think that's an important perspective to have. One of the areas I know that we've talked about, and I know is on the public's mind, particularly the folks that have come to us for public comment, you see it elsewhere as well, is this idea of learning loss. And part of it is, one, defining it. So what is learning loss? Is it just a fall off in assessment scores? Is it a fall off in SOL levels? Is it, it could be a number of different things. But one comment that kind of stuck in my mind was, while we're making these investments in coaches and teachers and assistants and all these other things, don't forget about some of the social, emotional, mental health resources that are also being applied, such as the counselors, behavioral health, things of that nature, because learning loss just isn't at least, one idea that was thrown out there that I would tend to agree with it. Learning loss just isn't a function of what we went through in COVID the last 2 years. There's factors at home. There's lots of things that contribute to a child not achieving some level of proficiency. And so we shouldn't lose sight of that as we think about this idea of learning loss, and just applying the investments in coaches and assistants. That's one part of the equation, but it necessarily isn't the full set of things that are being done to really help kids adapt over what's happened in the last few years. We had a pretty robust discussion about equity, which obviously a lot of us feel pretty strongly about. One of the in the context of teaching and education, really just, again, back to defining it. Like, what does it mean in terms of the budget, and how do we want to articulate our view of equity as it's reflected in the budget, so that we are applying our resources in a way that's equitable, not necessarily equal. And I think as we talk tonight, there'll be a couple things that come to mind that I'd like to get some input on, because I have from that discussion we had some thoughts about particularly the learning loss component of that. And then the last piece was really thinking about sustainability from the budget, fiscal sustainability. Part of it is time frame, right? So like, we think about the investments that we're making this year. How long do those investments need to be done on a recurring basis so that they have the time frame to yield the results that you want? If you want to use learning loss as an example, it's not going to be a one and done sort of thing, right? It's going to take more than a year to make up what's happened in the past. So, how do we take some of those investments that we're making in the budget and apply them to some sort of time frame? One, to be able to measure the impact of the investment, to know whether it's succeeding or not, but also if it's not succeeding, when do we then divert money from that to other things that might work better, or frankly just not spend on it anymore because what we wanted to spend on isn't achieving some desired result. That was so one of the questions they threw back to us was, well, how does the BAC view sustain, like fiscal sustainability? Like, how would you define it? We talked about, obviously, the deficits that are projected into the future, some assumptions that are made in the budget that are, necessary for even the deficit reduction measures that the budget assumes when you balance it in, say the third year projection, where it goes from like 70 million down to 18 million. That's still, a sizable assumption of revenue that has to be put in place to even get what was the $70 million deficit down to 18 million. And so we kind of left, one of the things we left with, and I definitely would like to hear views on this, is do we encourage the school board to go back to the county on the revenue sharing formula and the revenue side of it? Does APS need more from the county on a recurring basis to make these levels of investments that are needed? There was some view that may not be a welcome conversation at the county level, given the level of resourcing that we already get. And if you think about some of the other areas of the county that are having some challenges, particularly in, like first responders and things of that nature, there are some, hiring challenges, they too are having compensation challenges over there. And so just getting a view of the county and some of the challenges the counties that the county is having, would it even be a feasible conversation to have with Arlington County on the revenue component of the budget? It doesn't mean you don't have the conversation, but the reality was sort of portrayed that this is probably not going to be that year to have a conversation about getting more than what we're already getting. But it certainly is a challenge for the future, because when you look at the deficits that are projected, you can really, the school budget only gets revenue a couple of different ways. One is greater overall tax revenue to the county. I know my assessment went up. I'm sure others did as well this year. But how feasible are tax increases going to be over the next 3 years to help the county balance some of these deficits? It's a risk to this budget if we don't think about that. So that brief overview of what we discussed yesterday with the other advisory chairs. What I did ask them was if they had input to give it to me by Friday so that I had time to put it into the presentation. I really asked ASAC in particular, Special Education Committee, to give us some input because there is a volume of investment in this budget that I want to make sure that we note in our advice to the school board. But the other advisory chairs were offered the opportunity. So again, by Friday end of business, they've got to get whatever input to me, and then I'll put it together, and then we'll get it back out to the group, and then we'll go for final. Jennifer.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say that at our ASAC meeting last night, I think Dave is going to have some really good feedback for you. I was honestly really impressed with some of the thoughts that he put forward. They may not get at the sustainability issues, but they were smart in terms of, I think, kind of getting to, I think the request you had of us of if we want to put forward solutions, tell us how to pay for it. And I think he's squared that fairly well. And I think really, for me, when I saw what he was suggesting, I think really also gets like at the heart of some of these equity conversations too. So anyway, and I'm happy, like there are a handful of proposals. One, and just to kind of preview a little bit, but you'll see these when they come, is that instead of at the elementary school level, the planning factors being reduced by 2, they would be reduced by 1. And instead those FTEs would go to support additional, I'm going to get my terminology wrong, but essentially support additional FTEs for category 1, category 2 sort of students at the elementary level. And there were similar proposals at the middle school, sort of high school level. And that begins to pull in some of that planning factor work he presented on a month or so ago. And I think really gets at the heart of this equity is sort of issue too, where, not every school needs to have a planning factor reduced by 2. We certainly probably do need to be reducing school sizes, but we also know too that there are schools, and I know, for example, Drew, for example, has a very high student with disabilities population. I think it's 20% as of last year's numbers, which is higher than the average in APS. So you can imagine that being able to sort of adjust planning factors around students with disabilities potentially really can bring more equity to those schools with higher than average percentages. And I think that those are things that benefit not just the students with disabilities in those schools who have the greatest learning losses we're seeing from the dashboard, but I think also really help to benefit all general education students, frankly. So anyways, that's just a kind of a little preview. And I'm really excited that he has a chance to give that information to you and consider it, because I think there's some good ideas there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was, we had Jen, go ahead. Jen Wagner.
Sorry, I just, logistically, it looks like Eric dropped off, and I don't know if he's like in the room waiting to be let back in, or I was not expecting him to drop.
Yeah, I sent him the info again. I'm trying to get him on.
He was on, and now he's off. So anyway, I just wanted to make sure you knew in case he texted you or there's something else.
Yeah, he just shot me an email.
Okay.
Yeah. So I sent him the details. Hopefully he can get back in.
Chuck, there is a phone number 703-447-6773 in the lobby.
I can't see the lobby.
Okay. Do you want me? I can admit the person if you want me to.
Yeah, please. We'll hope that's Eric,
okay,
and someone Zoom bombing us. It's probably because you have an APS login and we don't.
Eric? Yes.
Eric, is that you? Eric, is that you, 703 number?
Yep, sorry, I'm just getting in. I've been trying to get in for about 20 minutes.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, so one of the things we talked about was, largely the investments being made in the budget are uniformly spread, for the most part, at least, from the reading of the budget. They appear to be uniformly spread across all the different schools. And so one of the, I brought up, and it was in the presentation, but that student progress dashboard, which, man, there's a lot of information in there. Not sure how to use it yet, but if you take that kind of data that APS is providing, do we approach these investments in a different way where, Jennifer, as you said, do we do the class size reduction in a different way, or do we kind of vary it by school instead of just a uniform, 2 per elementary school? Much like we're investing in teaching assistants and math and literacy coaches. Again, those are, I don't want to call it a planning factor because they're really not, but they're meant to be distributed rather evenly across the schools. Do we use some of the assessment data that we might find in the student progress dashboard and other stuff that ACTL might have in front of them? And, maybe everyone gets a baseline level of support, but certainly where the schools that are more significantly challenged with a larger volume of kids that need more help, having the ability to provide even more to those particular schools to help them out rather than just, sort of salami slicing the resource across each of the schools and then, for this year calling it good. So that was definitely one area of discussion we had yesterday. I'd certainly like to hear your guys' thoughts about that, because I see the wisdom of everybody getting something, but if we have assessment data that tells us that there are schools that definitely need a lot more help, then at least presenting it as an option to the school board, I think is worthy of consideration.
Oh yeah, I don't know if you guys can see my name, but I certainly agree with any approach that does not just evenly distribute funds across all schools, especially where they're not necessarily needed. So the idea of a baseline for all schools and then proportionately dividing the remaining funds or the schools that need them the most seems to be the approach.
Other thoughts? Bridget, I certainly agree with you, but I'm curious others how you feel about that. Jen?
Yeah, I totally agree. Obviously the details are how you define who needs it the most. I also think what could be really interesting is it could send an interesting message to all the schools who are just used to getting things in an equal basis, that they actually have to think harder and work harder about how they use what they have, right? You're not just going to get it now. You're going to get it based on how you can prove that it's valuable and that you need it.
Yeah. And go ahead.
I was going to say, so alternatively, though, I'm just going to take a counter approach, not that I necessarily believe this, but you could argue then that teachers would be, or people could be enticed to do less or work less hard because they know if they work less hard, they'll get more funding in the future. All right, so that's the counter argument to that one. But overall, I do agree we need to figure out a way to get more resources to the kids who need it most, right? That's the ultimate goal. And certainly there are schools that have a higher proportion of kids who need more help.
Yeah.
And we have to get them those funds. But we do have to recognize that even in the schools that do well, they have kids that need help as well. So the challenge there is, how do you distribute that across that, recognizing that all schools actually have kids who need help, some more for sure.
Mm-hmm.
How do you actually make that happen? Because when you get down to it, it's really hard to then. At some point, it's too hard to split a person, right? Because you're talking about, we can add 4 people, and that ends up being 0.125 of a person at this school and 0.7 at this. That's where we kind of get into operationally. How do we, make some of these suggestions work?
Yeah, and one of the points I tried to bring yesterday, and I don't know if I articulated it well or not, but some of this may be more, rather than the level of resourcing that we're about to provide for some of these areas, it may be more in the execution of it. That, we may have, based on the overall budget and the things that we have to spend that we can't ignore, such as compensation, things like that, right? I mean, we have, there's mandatory spending that must occur. So these investments that are more discretionary in nature, it may be that the resourcing level is probably about what we can make it, but then it's how do you execute it, which is less a BAC function. It's more an operational question for ACTL. But I think it's certainly appropriate from our end to say, look, here's a couple of different ways we might think about that. But if we don't find a way to give the schools that need more help, then from a budget perspective, you meeting your goal both in the strategic plan but also the budget direction, I'm not sure that we're getting there if the expectation is everyone's going to get the same allocation no matter what, regardless of need. So I'm trying to think of a succinct way to say that, but that's kind of where I feel that it may fall short in execution based on how the principals hire and use the resources. And I think that could be a challenge if we're really trying to arrest some of the learning loss or close some of the gaps between the different schools in terms of proficiency and performance. Jennifer?
Yeah, no, I this is a really good conversation. I thank you for leading this. I sort of hear what Eric sort of says. I think because I do sort of view this as being, while I think that, perhaps we need to have this broader equity conversation longer term as well. It is a long term as well as a short term conversation. I think in terms of the more learning loss that sort of we've seen, that, while some of that certainly well predates the pandemic, there is an element to this too, that as you've sort of alluded, Chuck, that it's certainly not a 1-year project, but it's, perhaps a focused 2 to 3 year sort of project, then that hopefully, informs practice moving forward too. I think it is, what I see is, in addition to maybe the execution sort of challenges that you all are pointing to, what I think it's good for us to bring this recommendation, some kind of recommendation to think about how to allocate based on the needs that are that you can, we have more data on now. But I doubt that APS is able to, in the time available this spring, significantly come up with something significantly different that operationalizes that, right, in the budget. But I think it's well worth us making the recommendation, and being sort of just one more voice sort of saying that we need to be thinking about how to reallocate resources to schools with greater needs, for whatever the reason may be.
Yeah.
So I'm really sort of liking this. I will say too, the other kind of thing I've been personally sort of working on in my, and I don't think this is a BAC sort of project, and I can imagine other people here may not be in favor of it either, but I feel really strongly that the county should really think about I think that revisiting the revenue sharing is probably a bridge too far at present for the reasons that have been sort of stated. But I do think that there's a very different case and argument to be made for a 2 to 3 year commitment above and beyond revenue sharing that is really tied to learning loss recovery, and is an additional commitment of resources. Keep in mind, the county also got a tremendous amount of money from the American Rescue Plan, and they have a 3-year budget that sort of accounts for it, and whatnot. And so, like, and then of course revenues recovering and whatnot. And I think there's a very strong argument to be made for the county and APS to think about a separate pot of funds that is really tied to pandemic recovery, and that's time limited in nature and is tied to sort of greater transparency and measures around it, right? Not just here's your money, that's part of the cost sharing and that's it, but really tied, you know, to this, to these kinds of things that we're seeing, the dashboard and conversations around it.
Okay. Sal?
Bit of a question, and maybe to pivot to the question of the funding formula, because I hate to sort of believe there are any sacred cows in anything. I always like to challenge this conventional wisdom, but I know that there's a formula, and it sounds like it's somewhat static, and I'd like to maybe understand what the sort of like dynamic is in a practical reality of this funding formula between school board and county board. Are there working groups to sort of address sort of, you know, developing this into something other than what it has been, so that we don't, it sounds like we'd be coming to them either this year or at some future point and just begging for money. I don't have any context that there's anything more to the relationship between the two bodies. And maybe, you know, I don't know, Chuck, if anyone else has any sort of perspective, I'd love to sort of be able to, you know, internalize that.
Yeah, Christina, would you have some perspective on that?
Everybody, I am on video, off video. I don't really know what's going on here. Apologies. I'm cooking. I am multitasking right now, hence why you are in my lovely kitchen. Welcome. It looks like every other kitchen. So the way that education funding works in the Commonwealth of Virginia is that school boards, with, I believe, no exceptions on this particular point of policy, are not allowed to levy taxes in their own right. So, for example, in other states, a school board can say we are imposing a 1% tax increase for this year to cover X, or we are doing this. We are doing a 2% tax increase to cover Y, whatever that happens to be. We in the Commonwealth of Virginia do not have that ability. And so we depend on localities to give us our revenue, like give us of their revenue, and give us, it's their primary source of revenue. Historically, many jurisdictions have, there are lots of jurisdictions in the Commonwealth even now who have to have battles with their local jurisdictions every single year in order to come to an agreement on what the revenue sharing is going to look like. And there are lots of my colleagues downstate that have to have protracted battles every single year of, hey, we need more this year, and nope, we're going to cut your budget by 20% or whatever that happens to look like. In order to avoid that, many moons ago, I believe this was in the 90s that this agreement came into play, but the county board and then the school board agreed on a percentage of the tax revenue base as the floor, essentially. And so that has creeped up marginally over the years. Leslie can probably tell you the specific number right now. I just can't remember it off the top of my head. But that, by having that percentage basis of what tax revenue is brought in, we don't have to have this fight. It's like 47 and change though, Chuck. It's not exactly 47.
Yeah,
it started at like 47,
and then it's some of the other fees and like,
yeah. It's like I think it started around 45 and then has just like creeped up like very, very marginally, like about 2 or 3% since then. But because of that, we don't have to have these funding battles with the county. When they have additional one-time revenue, or they have, for example, closeout, we get a proportional amount of that because it is our proportion of the closeout funds, or it is additional one-time revenue that they were not expecting that they then give out to us. And then we have the predictability of the funding. We have the predictability of that static amount of funding, or that static percentage of funding. The quantity, of course, fluctuates depending on what the actual revenue brought in ends up being. And it is important to remember that there are other revenue sources that the county gets and that we get that are not included. So that's like a little bit of the background. There has not been, to my knowledge, any working groups to unpack that or to discuss that. Does that answer the question, Sal? I know that was a little bit more.
No, that's actually really, actually really great context to understand that there's history, and you know, as we all know, history becomes a little bit stale at some point. It just becomes the way things are. So I'm trying to pivot looking forward to how do we make that paradigm flex to accommodate this budget and future budgets, so that we don't always, it seems like I was here last year and I'm here this year and we're just like, well, it'd be great if we can get more money out of the county. Well, I don't know if that conversation went anywhere or if it has even the vehicle to go somewhere. So I'm trying to understand, like, what do we do with that information?
I think it would require, to the point that Chuck alluded to at the very beginning, the palatability on the county board side is low to nil at this point, based on conversations that I've had and heard over the years. And so I think that would need to be a major driver for there to be any interest in having this conversation. As one board member, I'm always happy to have a conversation. I'm always happy to find us extra money. That's kind of the gist of it. If we can find, I'd be open to having the conversation, but at the point where we are right now with the current composition of the county board, and also the way that between the county manager and the superintendent, the way that things have been operating, this is not necessarily something that anyone is particularly, especially on their side, is jumping at the reins to have a conversation about.
Yeah. And that was the view in the room yesterday was, yeah, we can have it, but it's likely to not go anywhere. And in fact, there's also a thought that maybe APS can do a bit what we have with less. And so that was a word of caution as well. So
and remember that the student, we are just at the very first point where the student population is no longer outpacing the growth in our revenues. Like, we're finally at a point where our student population is at least projected for the next several years to be tapering off. So for the last decade, the amount of money going to the school system has increased out of necessity. And so this is the first time when we're actually able to make those foundational investments that we were not making before, because we were just growing. And we were doing the minimum. We were doing the things that were absolutely necessary, putting people into classrooms because we had students in those classrooms. So I think once we are in a little bit more of a stable situation, I think there might potentially be some more appetite, but it really does depend on my colleagues on the county board, because they ultimately are the ones that control the tax base.
Catherine.
Yeah, you've touched on some of the things that I was thinking while I was waiting. And Chuck, your audio cut out a bit, but I think that maybe you were saying that if we go back to address the formula, there's even the risk as the proportion of households with children is going down, or children as a percentage of our population is going down, whatever, that even the base formula could be threatened. And so I think that we should take the approach of going with the formula as it is, but then if there's unmet needs that we, specific identifiable needs, then we can have the discussion to get the funding for those needs. The formula. I wanted to reflect a little bit more okay, may I continue?
If I could just comment on that bit, and then you can go to your next point. I'm inclined, I think, to take that approach that, the funding formula this year is what we have. We have some extraordinary needs that could be short-term in nature, and, maybe, just encouraging the board to have the conversation with the county on very specific needs and ensuring that we can get, kind of pay as you go, one-time funding for some of those needs, not indefinitely, but certainly for a period of time. That might be about the best middle ground approach maybe that we can make on looking at the revenue side, because I certainly think there is risk that if the enrollment projections are confirmed and we lose students over time, then looking at it from the county manager's perspective, I definitely could see a move. Well, you guys have less students, so you don't need as much money as you did when you had more students. And I think that is definitely a risk that we need to be mindful of. And then you had another point, Catherine?
I did. I wanted to amplify what Jennifer was saying about isolating as, like, say, as a 3-year program or something, things that are the pandemic learning recovery, these specific programs that hopefully, after some series of learning recovery, we're back on whatever the trend is as far as student performance, and that the excess money that's coming from pandemic related funding in those programs be matched together and not be baked into the base run rate going ahead. Yeah, just call those out. And then just the last thing from the earlier discussion on equity and equality, just thinking that we're looking for equality of outcome, not of inputs, and people have already said variations on that.
Yeah. But I'm just writing that equality of outcome. I think that's a good way of shaping that conversation. So thank you. Bridget?
What Jennifer said about potentially asking the county for additional funds from the American Rescue Plan Act, because the county received about $46 million. Last May, they received half of that. And this May, in a month and a half, they'll receive the other half. And most of those funds were allocated. I did not see any allocated for schools per se. Of those funds, $7 million are unallocated for other things. The majority went to business, transportation, and other homelessness and other housing assistance and other immediate needs. But certainly if they're unallocated still, there's something there for us to probably ask for. And then secondly, the funds have to be spent by 2026, so we can use that as our time frame.
Yeah.
For that time period in which we want to use those funds for learning loss recovery.
If you wouldn't mind, Bridget, if you could just summarize that to Eric and I in an email. I definitely think that's a really good hook. I just want to make sure I can capture that as part of our presentation. What I'd like to do is just go through the different parts of the presentation here real quick. There's some things that I'll make changes to based on the discussion we've had tonight, just some ways that you've expressed things that are superior to the lengthy explanations I made on some of these. One area I'd like thoughts on, I think we've all noted the use of a lot of one-time funds and the use of reserves in terms of expressing how we feel about that as a group. Any thoughts or views there about saying it better? I certainly don't think the way I've said it, I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but I think it can obviously be expressed far better than how I've laid it out here. But I certainly see the need for investment, but I think we just have to be mindful of paying for recurring expenses with one-time funding to the degree that it's not risky to do so. If you have thoughts as you think about this over the next day or so, definitely send my way. Sorry, I'm going to go here to the equity piece. I think if everyone agrees, what I'd like to do is I'd like to put the top line here about the equality of outcome. That's if there's a simple but effective way to convey it, is that the investments that we're making should drive toward equality of outcomes. And then I think from there, these different options, right? Of you've got baseline levels of resourcing, and then you've got resourcing based on known gaps in assessment or achievement. And it at least gives the board a couple of different ways to think about it from our view. And then, it's probably more an execution than it is from a resource planning perspective. But thoughts here?
The one thing I said when we talk about equality of outcome, I mean, I think that just makes me think to what we've been trying to do over the last, I don't know how many years, right? Which is to reduce the performance gap, and we still can't get there. I mean, but I think when I hear equality of outcome, all I hear is that trying to address and address that performance gap. And I think if we're saying that, then maybe we need to be just that more explicit versus equality of outcome, because that's a very kind of generic kind of term and thought. I think we need to be a little more precise when we say, what does that mean? What is, if we say equality of outcome, what does that actually mean, right? I mean, I think we need to be a little more precise in what we are trying to accomplish.
Yeah, at least, and maybe it's not just, like in terms of learning and achievement, I think we want, to the degree it's possible, and it'll never be 100% perfect, right? But, we have, something that, we have a relatively similar achievement, assessment of proficiency, something like, we're, by school, we're achieving it, we're demonstrating proficiency at about the same rate, right? Or at the same level, at least as it affects learning. Now, obviously, other areas of the budget, equity probably means something a bit different, like English learning and things of that nature, where that's a different conversation. But I think at least from a, like academic achievement, not having the degree of disparity that we have now amongst the schools.
Yeah, and if that's the goal, if that's what we want to do, then I think we should state it, right? It needs to be. I think anything we present and we recommend in the end should be, I shouldn't say has to be, but it should be measurable, right? So that at some point in time, someone can say, hey, were we successful in doing this? Well, if you say a quality of outcome, that's really a hard thing to measure. But if you say kind of equivalent performance across all schools, that actually is easy. That's something we can measure. So I think that's something we just need to think about and maybe be, again, more exact and more precise.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree there. Other views or thoughts on that? Bridget?
Another view, but I agree with what Eric is saying. When I actually hear that, I mean, knowing what you've said about it, it makes perfect sense, equality of outcomes. But just reading that, equality to me, for a person who's really looking for equity, it doesn't give enough information. So I agree, Eric, to the extent that we can be more specific and state what it is we're trying to achieve, that would be preferred.
Okay, I'm going to make another stab at it. Just folks tell me if I'm off azimuth or not. Certainly, in terms of academic achievement, I think we want an environment where the resources that each school are given helps them achieve common levels or some similar level of performance. I do worry though that equity. You look at the different schools, right? My kids went to Discovery. At the time, it was the brand new elementary school in the county versus, some of our older schools. Equity, obviously from a facilities perspective, looks very different. and so certainly other areas of the budget, equity isn't necessarily the same view as opposed to academic achievement. So if there's other views about that, I definitely would like that input so that we capture it. But I'm going to make another stab at it and just kind of tell me, hey, yeah, that looks about right, or hey, Chuck, really say it this way, so that we, again, we capture at least the sense of how we're viewing this as a group. Let's see here. And I don't know that I'm not going to throw these charts up in the budget work session, but it does give, I think it does give us an opportunity that having this information available to us that not only is measurable, but it's accountable, I think is an important step that APS has taken. And I certainly think we want to encourage APS where we have other things like this equity dashboard that they're talking about. I think we certainly want to encourage the investment in, these things so that we can, we like it, on the advisory side, have the ability to look at information that helps us better shape our advice, I think, but also it's an accountability measure that is really important when we're talking about, in this case, it's, early literacy, but it could be, whatever they decide to provide in terms of data to us, to the public. I think it's also important from an accountability perspective that if we're making significant investments and we're not seeing performance, then why is that, and what should be done about that? So what I'll probably do is I'll probably just take these charts and just try to capture the spirit of that in a few succinct points. But I think just the fact that this data exists publicly now we're in a far better place than we were a year or two ago, where this kind of information wasn't as easily accessible. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, sorry, didn't raise my hand. This is kind of the first time I've seen something that allows us to start thinking about how do we more directly focus revenue in specific areas where there is clearly more need, because this data is very powerful that way.
Yeah, I just plugged I picked Discovery because I can at least have some frame of reference, but when I picked Claremont because I have someone I know that teaches there, and just the disparity between the two schools was striking. And so that is sort of the driver of yesterday's conversation about ways to target and focus resources in a way that is more assessment based than just planning factor sort of view. Jen and then Bridget.
Sorry, Bridget, I jumped in front of you. I was just going to say, agree with the data. It's a lot to take in. I mean, it's a little difficult without like a couple screens to really be able to compare things side by side. So I think just this is obviously a first step, but there's a lot of people that will not be able to digest this. So some way for APS to think over time about how they can summarize this in a way that's going to be useful for them and useful for the community. Because this is a lot. Like, all of us are going to jump into this, but most people are going to look at this stuff and they're going to have no idea what to do with it. Yeah.
And what does it mean? And does it mean anything, right? I mean, it's great, but yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I'm encouraged that we actually have this because it does give us a means to compare. But once you start measuring something, right, sometimes there's second and third order effects, or people use it in different ways that don't necessarily help drive a particular outcome. Bridget, and then Eric. Bridget, do you have anything? You had your hand raised, or was that something left over?
Yes, I was talking. Oh my
Nope,
gosh, I said
you
so
were
much good
muted.
stuff. Okay. No, I really like this, and this is exactly what I wanted to see. And like I said, because I'm new, I'm not familiar with where everything is, but having something like this is really useful in helping me understand where the needs need to be, and that's why I cannot emphasize enough the need for an equity emphasis board dashboard, one that we can go to similar to this, but is broken down, and not just by school and proficiency, but other ways too, where we can have side by side comparisons, to make good decisions, and then some way to look back, uh, what the trends are over time. I think would be very useful. So this is really good. Thank you. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, and I think the trend piece is also important because one area that we've struggled with is as you try to develop specific measures of performance, being able to consistently measure them over time and see if particular investments are actually making progress or not. And so I know some of you guys are in the consulting space, and so hey, we did this, we thought we were going to get this outcome, we didn't get it, so now what do we do? But if you don't have a way to consistently measure it, you never really can sort of lay out what's not working or working well. So I'm encouraged by this. So I'm going to try to find a way to summarize it in a more in a narrative, but I definitely think we should encourage APS to continue to do this and do more, as you said, Bridget, that this equity dashboard that is going to come online, like how do we use that then to drive resourcing decisions when it's necessary? Eric?
Somehow make sure with, sorry, I just want to make,
Yeah, go ahead.
add on to my previous point. Sorry. Also, one thing that is important to note that I see a lot when we throw money at a problem, we don't necessarily give it time to see how it will work. And then when we go to measure, we're measuring at the point of implementation where, it's at the beginning of the funding cycle, or, in the middle, or, so we need to somehow make sure we have a baseline date from which these things are measured, so that we're making sure we're looking at it after something has been implemented and then see it over time. Okay, thank you. I'm done now.
Eric?
Yeah, the only to Jen's point, unless you're like a data analysis person, sometimes these charts are hard to look at, and in fact sometimes they're paralyzing for people. But the key thing is just kind of pulling out the key insights, right? And that's really where these become powerful. But I think it even more so, not only finding, I just want to highlight this, not only finding kind of where the needs are and where we might be underperforming, but by finding the points where we're overperforming helps us. So, and I'm just going to pick out this one piece right here where we look at the Asian in the Asian ethnicity little box where they went from 40% to 83%. Understanding how that happened would be tremendously powerful to figure out how we can replicate that across a broader population, right? Yeah. So it's not just finding the needs, it's finding where we're outperforming, understanding why, and then how do we replicate that?
Yeah, what investments worked, and we had catastrophic success, so to speak.
Yep.
Or is there an outside influence, right? I mean, there's that too. There's some factors that are, I think about, at least the people I know up here, where I live. There were different things that folks did over the last year that, but they had the means to do so, and so keeping sight of that as well. Okay. Yeah, I've left a placeholder for special education because, again, we're making some significant strides in that, so I want to make sure that we capture that. Are there any other areas or ideas or thoughts that folks have? A couple minutes here. I just ask if you do have those, please send those to me and Eric. And then, I'll get this packaged up. I'll get it back out to everyone on Saturday. And then, for Tuesday, Eric, you and I will just need to talk. We get 2 seats. It's in person. It's not a Teams meeting, so it's a in-person meeting at the over at SciFax. So we'll have to. Obviously, folks are welcome to come as members of the public, and if you're there, if there are areas that maybe I certainly think I feel comfortable talking about everything, but if there are areas where some of you have some very specific emphasis that you look at, if you're in the public, I'm allowed to call on you to expand on a thought or to answer a question from the board. But principally, there'll be 2 of us at the table with the board, and we have an hour to go over it. So my goal was about 20 minutes of presentation and about 40 minutes of discussion / Q&A from the board or others. And it's kind of the layout of what will happen on Tuesday as part of the work session. So Eric, I think just you and I linking up and kind of strategizing our time and how we approach it.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, so it's about 8 o'clock. Certainly don't want to keep anyone longer than that. I appreciate the discussion tonight. A lot of good feedback. Any input that you wish to give me, I really need by Friday, end of day, so that I've got 24 hours to turn that back around. And then it's right now it's Tuesday, I believe it's 6:30. Christina, Leslie, is that right? Tuesday, 6:30 is the BAC start point.
I believe so. Let me just confirm.
For those that won't be there in person, it's streamed just like any of the other school board meetings. And
update. It is at 6:30.
Okay, so Tuesday at 6:30. If you can't be there in person as part of the public, obviously you can. It'll be streamed live. The board section of APS. Again, Friday end of day is the last point, which I think I can take input, so I can repackage everything and give the board, Leslie, and others sufficient time to absorb our feedback and have time to prepare for our work on Tuesday. Again, appreciate everyone's input and thoughtfulness tonight. This is a really different budget environment, and so it's nice to be able to talk about the things we want to do now for the first time rather than the things we're going to do without. So it's definitely a much different place to be in fiscally, which I think if we use it wisely, we can really see some results from that in a few years. So I hope that we're able to sustain this level of investment that they're looking to make. Michael, go ahead.
Thanks, Chuck. I just wanted to say thank to you, especially for organizing all this. This is looking great, and to everyone else about this discussion. It's been fantastic tonight. I got on a couple minutes late, and this wasn't really part of our discussion tonight, but I wanted to circle back on something I brought up at our last meeting, which I already shared with you, Chuck, when I sent in my comments. But I was looking into the payroll questions about HR and stuff that I've been looking into, and did find that in the report from the consultant that was done, there was some information that I'll send out and share with everybody, but didn't want to flood everybody's inboxes when we were supposed to be working on this particular part of the budget. So I'll send that out afterwards, but did want to say that I did find some interesting information, not everything that I've been asking about. So I'm hopefully looking forward to getting that HR report at the end of the year when the board gets that and seeing what that looks like. But it did help answer some of those questions I had. So since I've been asking about that for several weeks, I wanted to make sure I followed up with everybody and make sure I shared it with you. But my big point tonight is nice job, Chuck, on all this. This has been fantastic. This is great that we've been putting this together. And I really appreciate the collaboration that's gone into it. I saw a lot of the comments that were just matched basically what I had been thinking already. And I really appreciate everybody's work on this, especially yours. So thank you.
No, appreciate it. So we'll do the work session on Tuesday. That will be, in effect, our meeting for April. After the budget work session, really what we'll spend the rest of our time up to June is preparing our end of year report. So once the dust settles from the budget work session, we get that out of the way. What we'll really do is begin to pull together all our thoughts and ideas for our standard end of year report that we put together for the school board. And really what that does is it's a, just think about a summary of recommendations and insights that we have, but really what it's our opportunity to do is to really provide that initial input into the budget direction for next year. And so that will be a part of that conversation. Be more to come on that. Get through the big event next Tuesday, and then we can move on to, the final couple of months worth of work we have, and then off to the summer. So appreciate everyone's time tonight. Thank you. And again, Friday end of day. It's the last point I can take it, and then we'll go for final. So again, appreciate everyone's insights and thoughts.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much. Great meeting.